touch her again," he said, and I felt the whole room drop 10 degrees before I even turned around. I was still in my wedding dress. I had been married for 6 hours, and a security guard already had his hand closed around my arm like I was something he'd caught shoplifting. I want to tell you how I got there, because none of it makes sense unless you know where I started. My name is Maya Bennett, 28 years old, and 3 weeks before that airport lounge, I was exactly nobody. I shelved returns at a library in Brooklyn Heights. I microwaved the same lentil soup 4 nights a week, kept a dying spider plant alive out of stubbornness more than skill, and hadn't been on a date in over a year. I had a scar on my left palm from a bookshelf that fell on me when I was 19, and I told people it was from a kitchen accident because the truth felt embarrassing. I was not the kind of woman men like King Jun-ho married. I was the kind of woman who read about women like that in library books and put them back on the shelf when I was done. My father called me on a Tuesday afternoon while I was reshelving a returned copy of a novel I don't even remember the title of anymore. And his voice on the phone was a voice I hadn't heard since I was a little girl watching him cry in a hospital hallway. "Maya," he said, "I need you to come home." Now, I almost didn't go. We hadn't spoken in 5 months, not since I found out he'd mortgaged my dead mother's house without telling anyone. But something in his voice pulled at the part of me that still loved him despite everything, and 2 hours later I was sitting in my childhood living room, learning that my family's entire life was a controlled demolition that had already started. He was 3 weeks from losing the house. He was facing fraud charges he swore were manufactured by men he used to call friends. Our name, the Bennett name, which had meant something once in import shipping circles, was already being spoken like a punchline in rooms I'd never sit in. He wouldn't tell me at first who he suspected of manufacturing the charges, only that he'd trusted the wrong partners at exactly the wrong moment, and it would be almost a year before I understood how much larger and older that betrayal actually was than the version he told me that afternoon. And then he told me there was a way out, a marriage pact, signed 40 years ago by my grandfather and a family my father would only describe as very old, very powerful, and very Korean. I laughed at first. I actually laughed, standing in that living room, because it sounded like something out of the books I shelved for a living. Then I saw my mother crying silently on the couch, and I stopped laughing. The man who came to explain it to me was named Min-soo. Mid-40s, quiet, dressed like he'd never once been underdressed for anything in his life. He told me the pact was real and enforceable, but that the man at the center of it, Kang Jun-ho, would not force an unwilling bride. "If I said no, we walk away," he told me. "No consequences for your family." I want you to remember that Min-soo told me that, because it matters later. Everything he told me that day was true. That was the trap. He never lied to me once, and that's exactly why I trusted him completely, and exactly why I never saw what was coming from him. There's something else I should tell you about the man I married, something I only learned in pieces over that first year, because he never offered his own history freely. Kang Jun-ho took control of his family's operation at 26, 3 years after his older brother, the one who was supposed to inherit everything, was killed in a dispute June still won't discuss in detail, even with me, even now. He told me once, late at night, that he'd buried his brother on a Tuesday and taken his first meeting as head of the family on a Wednesday, because grief, in his world, was a currency other men would spend against you if you let them see it. I asked him if he'd ever forgiven whoever was responsible. He looked at me for a long moment and said forgiveness wasn't a word his world had much use for, only accounting, and that the men responsible had been made to understand, permanently, the cost of what they'd done. I didn't ask for details. Some doors I learned not to open, at least not yet, not until I understood enough about the house I was living in to walk through them safely. I met Jun 3 nights later in a private dining room with more forks on the table than I knew what to do with, and I want to be honest with you about the first thing I felt when he walked in, because it wasn't fear. It was that the air in the room seemed to reorganize itself around him. He was tall in a way that made the room feel smaller, dressed in black, with a face so precisely made it looked almost unkind, and eyes that did not do what other people's eyes did when they looked at you, which is flicker and wander and soften. His eyes just held. "I don't believe in love, Miss Bennet," he told me, less than 10 minutes into knowing him. "I believe in loyalty, in keeping my word. I can offer you those things, not romance." I remember feeling something in my chest that I now understand was relief, because at least he wasn't lying to me the way everyone else in my life had been lying to me for months. I said yes for my parents. I want that on the record, in my own voice, forever. I did not say yes because a beautiful, terrifying man asked me to. I said yes because I watched my father's hands shake around a coffee cup, and I could not let that be the last image I had of him. Jun told me the marriage would come with rules, no expectations. I would have his name, his protection, eventually an heir, and in exchange he would not interfere in the rest of my life. It sounded, God help me, almost businesslike. It sounded survivable. Before I signed anything, Min-soo walked me through the pact itself, page by page, in a conference room with a view of a city I'd never once felt like I belonged to. He was patient in a way I found strangely comforting, answering every question I threw at him without flinching, even the ugly ones. "What happens if he changes his mind after the wedding?" I asked. "He won't," Min-soo told me, and I believed him completely, because nothing in his face suggested he was protecting anyone but me. "What happens if I want out in a year, in 5 years?" "There's a clause," he said, sliding a page toward me, "for exactly that. He gave you an exit no one made him give you." I remember thinking, sitting in that room, that Min-soo was the one honest thing in a world built entirely out of leverage. I would spend the better part of a year unlearning that thought, one piece at a time, and I still don't know how much of that kindness in the conference room was real, and how much of it was simply the first move in a much longer play. The morning of the wedding, my mother zipped me into that altered dress, with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, and I watched her face in the mirror instead of my own, because I couldn't stand to look at myself yet. "You don't have to do this," she whispered, so quietly I almost missed it. "Even now, even today, if you want to walk away, your father and I will find another way." I know she meant it. I also knew there was no other way. Not really, not with the house 3 weeks from foreclosure, and my father's name already halfway to ruin in every circle that mattered to him. I told her I wanted to do it, which wasn't quite a lie, and wasn't quite the truth either. It was somewhere in between, the way most of my choices that year lived somewhere in between. She kissed my forehead and told me I looked like her mother, a woman I'd never met, a woman whose name I'd never once heard spoken in our house before that morning. I didn't think anything of it then. I had no reason to. Min-soo picked me up from the hotel in a black car with tinted windows, and for the length of that ride he was almost fatherly, telling me small, useless facts about the ceremony room, the number of guests, which fork was for which course, as if any of it mattered, as if I wasn't about to marry a man I'd met exactly twice. "You'll be fine," he told me at a red light, not looking at me, looking straight ahead through the windshield instead. "He's not what people say he is, not with the people he decides are his." I asked him how he could be so sure. "Because I've watched him decide it exactly twice in 18 years, he said, and something in his voice sounded almost wistful, almost sad, in a way I filed away without understanding, the way I filed away so many small true things that year and only understood the shape of them later, once the folder was already in my hands. I walked down that aisle in my mother's altered dress, and when June looked up and our eyes met, something happened that neither of us had built into the arrangement. His whole body went still, like he'd been struck by something he hadn't seen coming. I felt it too, a pull low in my stomach that had nothing to do with contracts or pacts or debts. When he kissed me at the altar, chaste, appropriate, exactly what the room expected, his hand cupped my face like I was something he was afraid to break, and he held it a half-second too long. "Mine," he mouthed against my mouth, so quiet only I could have caught it. I didn't understand yet what that word would end up costing both of us. We were supposed to fly out that same afternoon. The jet wasn't ready. Jun sent me ahead to the VIP lounge with his black card and a promise that he'd be right behind me. And that decision, that ordinary, forgettable decision, is the reason I ended up standing at a reception counter in my wedding dress, while a woman with sharp cheekbones told me my husband's credential was flagged and picked up a phone to call security on me, like I was a thief who'd wandered in off the street. I didn't know yet that the flag on that card wasn't a system error. I want you to hold on to that. I'll come back to it. The two guards who materialized around me had hands that didn't hesitate the way hands are supposed to hesitate around a woman in a wedding dress, with tears already burning in her eyes. One of them closed his fingers around my arm, not gently, and I felt every eye in that lounge land on me at once. The particular humiliation of being stared at by strangers who have already decided you're guilty of something. I'd spent my whole life being invisible. I would have given anything in that moment to go back to being invisible, and then the temperature dropped, and a voice behind me said the 4 words that opened this story: "Touch her again, and you'll regret it." The guard's hand fell off my arm like he'd touched a live wire. I turned around, and my husband was standing in the doorway of that lounge, like something out of a story I would never have believed if I hadn't lived it, and the entire room, every single person in it, bowed or stepped back or simply stopped breathing. He didn't raise his voice once. He asked one question: "Who authorized you to touch my wife?" And by the time he was done asking it, the attendant who'd humiliated me was apologizing so hard I thought she might collapse, and a manager I hadn't even seen arrive was offering us a private suite like his life depended on it, which, I would come to understand, it very nearly did. In the privacy of that suite, with his jacket around my shoulders and the adrenaline finally starting to drain out of my legs, June asked me if they'd hurt me, and something in his voice had changed completely from the cold blade he'd used on the guards. "No one," he told me, "will ever treat you that way again." It sounded like a promise. It also sounded, underneath it, like a threat aimed at someone who wasn't in that room yet. I didn't know it then, but he was already making a list. I didn't know that list would eventually include a name much closer to us than a rude hotel attendant. We flew to a private island that night, and for the first 2 days I existed in a kind of suspended disbelief, walking through overwater bungalows and private beaches like I'd wandered onto a film set of someone else's life. June was attentive in a careful, controlled way, solicitous but never crossing the line he'd drawn around himself. I asked him about the ink that crawled up from beneath his collar one night over whiskey, and he told me, in that low, unhurried voice, that every line of it was earned. "Loyalty unto death," he said, tracing the Korean characters at his throat, "is what this one means." I took my oath at 18. I asked him if he was ever afraid, knowing how many people wanted him dead, and he told me fear was a weakness he'd eliminated a long time ago. "Everyone's afraid of something," I told him. "Not anymore," he said, and looked at me in a way that made me wonder if that sentence had an exception clause, and if I was it. On the 3rd morning I went walking alone, needing space to think, and ran directly into the one person on earth I least wanted to see. Derek Cole had made my last 2 years of high school a kind of quiet siege, and here he was in the Maldives with a group of friends who laughed the way people laugh when they've never once had to worry about consequences. He called me by name like an accusation. "Charity case," he said, loud enough for the whole open-air restaurant to hear. "Still going by that? Your father's business went under, so how exactly are you affording a place like this? Are you whoring yourself out to rich men now?" he asked, and grabbed my wrist when I tried to walk away. And I felt every old wound from those years open up at once, the particular helplessness of being 15 again in front of him. "Remove your hand." June's voice, when it came, was so quiet it was almost gentle, and that was somehow worse than shouting. Derek's friend, the one who apparently knew things the rest of them didn't, went white and started apologizing before June had even said a full sentence, grabbing Derek's shoulder and hissing that he had no idea who he was talking to. June didn't touch Derek. He didn't need to. He told him, in that same level voice, that by sunset the next day his family's accounts, his father's business connections, his entire reputation would cease to exist, and there was nothing Derek could do to stop it. Then he took my hand and walked me away, and I want to be honest that some small, ugly, tired part of me felt something close to satisfaction. I didn't fully understand yet how literal that threat had been. The next morning, Derek was on our private terrace, hollow-eyed, begging me to make it stop. His father's accounts were already frozen. Business partners were already dropping him, 24 hours, and an entire life had been dismantled exactly the way June said it would be. I stood on that terrace and understood, really understood for the first time, the size of the machine I'd married into. I asked June to stop, and he did, immediately, the moment I asked. No argument, no ego. That's when I understood something else. This man who could erase a person's future with 3 phone calls would drop it all the second I said the word stop. That contradiction, cruelty on command and gentleness on request, is what broke something open in me. "I want years with you," he told me later that week, his forehead pressed to mine in the outdoor shower, water running down the dragon inked across his chest. I didn't know I could feel like this. I told him I loved him first. He said it back like a confession he'd been holding his breath on his whole life. "I have since you walked down that aisle," he said. "Maybe even before. I just didn't know what it was. I'm telling you all of this, the tenderness, because you need to understand what I had before I tell you what almost took it away from me. And I need you to remember one more thing I noticed on that island and didn't understand yet." Minsu called June 3 times during our 2 weeks there, each time stepping out of earshot, each time returning with a face that gave away nothing at all. I thought it was business. I filed it away and didn't think about it again until it was almost too late to matter. On our last night on the island, Jun did something I hadn't expected from a man who kept his rules folded so carefully around himself. He canceled the private dinner the staff had arranged and instead cooked for me himself, badly, oversalting a pot of rice he clearly hadn't made since he was young, and told me, while we ate it anyway and laughed harder than either of us had laughed all week, about the mother he'd lost when he was 9, a woman his father almost never mentioned, whose face he said he sometimes had trouble remembering, except in dreams. I understood, sitting there with him in the low lamplight, that I was being given something rarer than his protection. I was being given the parts of him his own family had trained him to keep locked away. I told myself that whatever else was true, whatever I didn't yet know about the machinery around us, that honesty in the kitchen was real. I still believe that. It's one of the only things from that trip I never had to unlearn. We came home to New York a married couple in every sense that counted, and I moved into a penthouse 30 stories above a city I was only beginning to understand my husband quietly controlled. The first month back, I found a locked drawer in the study I wasn't supposed to be in, and inside it, buried under contracts I couldn't read, was an old photograph of 2 men shaking hands, one of them a younger version of Jun's father, the other a man I didn't recognize, standing in front of a shipping warehouse with a name painted on the side that made my stomach drop for reasons I couldn't explain. Choi Imports, my mother's maiden name, the name she'd stopped using entirely after she married my father, was Choi. I told myself it was a coincidence. I filed that away too. It would not stay filed for long. There were good months in between all of this, and I don't want to skip past them, because they're the reason everything after hurt as much as it did. June started taking me with him to smaller meetings that spring. Nothing dangerous, he was careful about that, but real, a conversation with a restaurant owner who needed a loan restructured on terms that didn't ruin him, a sit-down with a union representative that ended in handshakes instead of threats. I watched my husband be patient and fair with people who had no power to make him be anything at all, and I understood, watching him, that the reputation that preceded him into every room was only half the truth of who he was. He taught me small things too, how to read a room the way he did, how to tell the difference between silence that meant respect and silence that meant fear, how to sit at a table full of dangerous men and never once let my face give away what I was thinking. "I'm not teaching you this because I want you in this world," he told me one night, undoing his tie after a long dinner. "I'm teaching you because you're already in it, and I'd rather you understand the water than drown in it." I loved him more in that sentence than I had in almost any other moment before it, because it was the first time he'd admitted, out loud, that marrying me hadn't kept me safely outside his life the way the original pact had promised. It had simply pulled me all the way in, and he knew it, and instead of pretending otherwise, he'd decided to arm me for it. 3 months into our marriage, I started noticing things I couldn't unsee once I'd seen them. Minsu, who I had trusted since the day he told me the truth in my parents' living room, began appearing in places he had no obvious reason to be, outside the library where I still volunteered on weekends, in the lobby of my parents' new apartment, the one June had quietly paid for. Once, unmistakably, in a car parked across from the small church my mother had started attending again. I told myself he was protecting me. June had people watching me. Of course he did. That was the world now. But there was something in the way Minsu looked at me when he didn't know I'd noticed him. Something calculating instead of protective, and I couldn't shake it. Jun's father, in those early months, was harder to read than anyone else in that family, and I spent longer trying to understand him than I ever admitted to Jun. He watched me at every gathering with the particular attention of a man doing arithmetic he didn't want to show his work on, and it was months before I understood that his silences toward me weren't coldness at all. They were a kind of guilt he had no vocabulary for, coming from a man who had built his entire life on never needing one. He complimented my table settings once, out of nowhere, at a dinner where I'd barely said 10 words, and told me, in careful English he rarely bothered using around me, that my grandmother used to arrange flowers the same deliberate way. It was the closest he ever came, before everything came apart, to telling me the truth outright, and I was too unprepared for it in the moment to ask him a single follow-up question. I've thought about that dinner more times than I can count since. I think, in his own broken way, he was trying to warn me and trying to apologize, both at once, in the only language his life had ever taught him to use. The breadcrumbs kept coming. My mother, over dinner one night, let slip that her own mother, my grandmother, had left Korea under circumstances she'd never fully explained, and that the Choi name had once meant something in a business her grandmother refused to discuss even on her deathbed. Jun's father, at a family gathering I was required to attend with a smile fixed on my face, looked at me for one long uncomfortable moment and said, almost to himself, "You have her eyes," before catching himself and changing the subject entirely. I asked Jun that night who he meant. His jaw tightened in a way I'd learned to recognize as him deciding how much truth I could handle. "Someone from a long time ago," he said. "It's not important." I believed him because I wanted to, and because I didn't yet understand that the man I trusted most in the world had started keeping the one secret that would eventually put a gun in a room with both of us in it. There was a night, about 6 weeks after we came home, that I think about more than almost any other. Jun's father hosted a family dinner, the kind with too many courses and too much silence between them, and I sat through it in a dress Jun had chosen because he said the color would put the older women at ease. Halfway through the second course, one of Jun's aunts asked, in the too casual voice people use when they already know the answer to a question, whether my mother had ever mentioned relatives back in Korea. I said I didn't think so. The table went quiet for exactly 1 beat too long, the kind of silence that isn't empty, it's full, packed with things nobody at that table was going to say out loud in front of me. Jun's hand found mine under the tablecloth and held on hard enough that I understood, even then, before I understood anything else, that he already knew something I didn't. I asked him about it in the car afterward. He told me his aunt talked too much and asked me to let it go. I let it go because I trusted him, and because some small cowardly part of me didn't want to know yet what I was starting to suspect. Minsu, in those weeks, became a fixture at the edges of my life, in a way I told myself was simply thoroughness. He drove me to the library twice when Jun was out of the country. He sat with my father once, for almost 2 hours, in a coffee shop near my parents' new apartment, and when I asked my father about it later, he said Minsu had just been checking in, making sure the family was settling in well. I remember feeling grateful. I remember thinking I was lucky to have married into a family that came with a man like that watching over the people I loved. I did not yet understand that watching over and watching for are not the same verb, and that Minsu had been doing the second one the entire time. The third encounter, The one I understand now as the true turning point happened at a charity gala June's family hosted every spring. The kind of event where I was expected to smile for 200 people whose names I'd never remember and whose judgment I could feel anyway, like static in the air. A woman I didn't recognize approached me near the bar, older, elegant, with a face that seemed to be searching mine for something specific. "You look so much like her," she said, before I could even introduce myself. "Like who?" I asked, and watched her expression shutter closed the second she realized what she'd said out loud. "Nothing," she said. "Forgive me, I mistook you for someone else," and disappeared into the crowd before I could ask another question. I found June across the room minutes later and told him what happened, and for the first time since I'd known him, I watched him go somewhere far away behind his own eyes, somewhere I couldn't follow, before he pulled himself back and told me it was nothing, some old woman's confused memory, nothing worth worrying about. I let it go, the way I'd let so much go that year, but that night, alone in the bathroom of our penthouse, I looked at my own face in the mirror for a long time, searching it the same way that stranger had searched it, and found nothing I recognized as an answer. I started, quietly, without telling anyone, to look into the name Choi myself. It felt small and almost silly at first, an evening here and there on the library's research databases after closing, the same skills I'd used my whole career to help strangers find birth records and property deeds, now turned, for the first time, on my own family. I found almost nothing at first, the kind of nothing that is itself a kind of answer, records scrubbed or simply never digitized, a business that seemed to have existed and then, abruptly, in the space of a single year, stopped existing entirely. I found one newspaper clipping, badly scanned, mentioning a shipping dispute and a name, Choi, listed among several companies absorbed in a wave of consolidations that swept through the industry that year. I printed it and kept it folded in my coat pocket for 2 weeks before I worked up the nerve to ask my mother about it directly, and even then I didn't get very far, because she changed the subject so fast and so completely that I understood, for the first time, that whatever she knew, she had decided a long time ago never to say it out loud. The gut punch came on an ordinary Thursday. I was doing exactly what I'd been doing the day my father first called me, reshelving books, trying to hold on to some scrap of the life I'd had before, when Min-soo found me in the stacks. He didn't smile the way he usually did. He told me, quietly, that he needed to show me something, and that Jun could never know he'd been the one to show it to me. He handed me a folder, and inside it were documents 40 years old, a marriage pact, yes, the one I already knew about, but stapled behind it, a second document I had never been told existed, a death certificate. My grandmother's, dated the year my mother was 11 years old, except the name on it wasn't Choi. It was a name that matched, almost exactly, the man in the photograph shaking hands with Jun's father. My grandmother had not simply left a business behind when she left Korea. She had been the last living heir of a syndicate Jun's father had spent decades systematically absorbing, piece by piece, territory by territory, and the marriage pact between our families hadn't been a kindness offered to a bankrupt friend of the family at all. It had been the final, elegant move in a 40-year campaign to fold the last unclaimed piece of the Choi Empire back into Kang hands, through me, through my blood, without a single shot fired. I want to tell you I felt betrayed by June in that moment, and for one terrible hour in a library storage room, I did. I thought my husband had married me as the last move in his father's war, that everything, the tenderness, the promise, the word mine breathed against my mouth at the altar, had all been strategy wearing the face of love. I didn't know it yet, but that folder in my hands was about to make Min-soo the most dangerous man in my life, not because of what he'd shown me, but because of what he still hadn't. I sat on the floor of that storage aisle for almost an hour after Min-soo left, the folder open in my lap, reading the same 3 documents over and over as if reading them again would change what they said. A marriage pact, a death certificate with a name that wasn't the one I'd grown up with. A photograph of 2 men shaking hands in front of a warehouse that shared its name with the company my grandmother had apparently once owned, or led, or died defending. I still didn't fully know which. I thought about every dinner with Jun's family, Every too long silence, every time someone had looked at my face like they were reading a name off it instead of a person. I thought about the woman at the gala. You look so much like her. I understood, sitting there, that I had spent an entire year being quietly, carefully studied by an entire family who already knew exactly who I was, while I had known almost nothing about myself at all. I confronted June that night, the folder shaking in my hands, and I watched something break across his face that I had never seen there before, not fear of me, but fear for me, sudden and total. He told me he hadn't known, not all of it, not the death certificate, not the full shape of what his father had built our marriage on top of. He told me his father had mentioned an old pact and a bankrupt family, and nothing more, that Minsu, had been the one who brought him my file in the first place, hand-picked, presented as a perfect solution. I watched him understand, in real time, exactly as I was understanding it, that the man he trusted most after his own father had known exactly whose granddaughter he was marrying him to, and had said nothing. Then he said 4 words. Minsu works for them. The room went silent around us in a way that had nothing to do with sound. I finally understood, all at once, the way a puzzle resolves itself the instant the last piece drops into place. No longer separate images, but one complete, terrible picture. Minsu hadn't just kept a secret. He'd spent 3 years quietly rebuilding contact with the surviving edges of the old Choi network, men scattered and hidden after the syndicate fell, feeding them information a piece at a time, using the marriage he himself had engineered as his opening. He hadn't wanted the Kang family to absorb the Choi bloodline quietly through me. He'd wanted to use me, the last blood claim, to reopen the war and take the whole empire for himself, with the Choi remnants backing, once he'd positioned himself close enough to both families to strike at the center of each. I didn't sleep at all the 2 nights between that confrontation and what came after. I lay awake replaying every kindness Minsu had ever shown me, sorting each one into 2 piles, real and performance, and finding I couldn't sort most of them at all, which was its own kind of grief. There was a version of that week where I let myself hate him cleanly, without complication, and it would have been so much easier than the version I actually lived, the one where I kept remembering the ride to my own wedding, his voice at that red light telling me June wasn't what people said he was, and wondering whether that single true thing had been the one piece of himself he'd never managed to fully weaponize, even at the end. June barely slept either. I'd wake at 3, at 4, and find him standing at the window of the safe house with his phone pressed to his ear, his voice pitched low and clipped in Korean, giving orders I couldn't follow but could feel the weight of. Once he came back to bed and pulled me against his chest without a word, and I felt his heartbeat going too fast for a man who claimed he'd eliminated fear a long time ago. I don't remember falling asleep that night. I remember waking up to the sound of his phone buzzing against the nightstand at 5 in the morning, and the particular stillness that came over his whole body when he read whatever was on the screen. The climax came 4 nights later, in the penthouse I had only just started calling home. June had me moved to a safe house across the city the moment he understood what Minsu was capable of. But I refused to stay there once I learned Minsu had already made contact with my mother, using her grief over a mother she barely remembered as the thread to pull her toward a meeting he'd framed as closure. I went to that meeting instead of her, in a warehouse that used to belong to a company called Choi Imports, because I would rather stand in front of a gun myself than let it find my mother by accident. June found out I was gone 11 minutes after I left the safe house. I had until midnight to be somewhere else, somewhere his men could reach me, or the deal Minsu was offering me. My silence and my blood claim in exchange for my mother's safety would become the only deal on the table. I stood in that warehouse and listened to Minsu explain, almost gently, that none of this was personal, that I had simply been the most useful key he'd ever been handed. And I understood, standing there, that the folder he'd given me in the library hadn't been an act of conscience at all. It had been the first move of a much longer game, meant to turn me against June just long enough to isolate me. "You don't have to sign anything tonight," he told me, his voice still carrying that same patient, fatherly warmth he'd used with me in that conference room a year earlier. The warmth I now understood had never once been real. "Your mother is safe as long as you're reasonable," he said, and I remember thinking, with a strange, cold clarity that surprised even me, that I was done being reasonable for other people's benefit. I asked him, stalling, whether any of it had been real, the rides to the library, the coffee with my father, the exit clause he'd shown me with such careful patience on my very first day in that world. Some of it, he admitted, and for just a moment something almost like regret passed over his face before it closed again. Regret doesn't change outcomes, he told me. Only leverage does. I was still working out what to say to buy myself more time when the warehouse door came off its frame, and Jun walked through it the way he'd walked into that airport lounge on the first day of our marriage, except this time there was nothing controlled left in his face at all. What happened in the next 4 minutes I still don't fully have words for, only fragments. Min-soo's voice, calm at first, then not. The sound of a folder of documents, the real one, the one that proved everything, hitting a concrete floor. Jun's voice telling Min-soo that loyalty unto death had never once, in 18 years, meant what Min-soo had decided it meant. And then it was over, faster than I could process, Jun's men already moving Min-soo out of that warehouse in restraints instead of a body bag, because Jun told me later, quietly, that he needed him alive long enough to unravel exactly how deep the Choi remnant network went, and because, he admitted, some buried piece of him still couldn't make himself finish 18 years of loyalty with his own hands, not completely, not yet. What happened in the next 4 minutes I still don't fully have words for, only fragments. Min-soo's voice, calm at first, then not. The sound of a folder of documents, the real one, the one that proved everything, hitting a concrete floor. Jun's voice telling Min-soo that loyalty unto death had never once, in 18 years, meant what Min-soo had decided it meant, and then it was over, faster than I could process, Jun's men already moving Min-soo out of that warehouse in restraints instead of a body bag, because Jun told me later, quietly, that he needed him alive long enough to unravel exactly how deep the Choi remnant network went, and because, he admitted, some buried piece of him still couldn't make himself finish 18 years of loyalty with his own hands, not completely, not yet. Before they took him out of that warehouse, Jun's men found what Min-soo had been keeping in a second folder, hidden inside a lining of his jacket. A set of transfer documents drafted and ready to file, my name already forged onto a signature line, beside a claim to territory I hadn't even known existed until that night. Midnight had been Min-soo's real deadline all along, not mine. If he'd gotten me to sign, willingly or otherwise, before the clock ran out, the paperwork would have gone through a judge Jun's father no longer controlled, and the Choi claim would have passed, cleanly and legally, into Min-soo's hands through me, before anyone could stop it. Watching Jun's lawyer read that timestamp out loud in the warehouse, minutes past midnight, minutes past the window Min-soo had needed, was the closest I have ever come to understanding how much can hinge on a single hour you don't even know you're living inside. I want to close every part of this for you, because I promised myself I would, sitting in that warehouse with my husband's arms around me, while sirens I never actually heard existed somewhere far away in a city that had no idea what had almost happened in it that night. Min-soo is gone now, not dead, but gone in every way that matters, held somewhere I've never been told the location of, by people I've stopped asking questions about. The Choi network he tried to rebuild dissolved within weeks once its remaining pieces understood the man leading them had been using them as much as he'd used me. My grandmother's name, the one my mother had buried her whole life, sits framed now in a hallway of our penthouse, not as a claim on anything, but as a woman Jun's father, in the strangest apology I have ever witnessed a man like him make, personally insured, was given a proper memorial 40 years too late. A year has passed since that warehouse. My father's charges were dismissed months ago, his name quietly restored, though he tells me now, and I believe him, that he's done chasing anything that isn't small and safe and his own. He works part-time now at a small shipping consultancy 2 blocks from his old office, no ambitions beyond it, and for the first time in years I don't worry when I see his name on my phone. My mother visits a grave in Korea every spring that she never knew she was allowed to grieve at before. Jun's father, of all people, is the one who arranged the flights for her first trip, and stood beside her at that grave in a country he hadn't visited in over a decade, though he's never once explained to me why, and I've stopped asking. Some debts, I've learned, get paid in silence. I still work at the library 2 mornings a week, not because I need to, but because some part of the woman I was before all of this refuses to disappear entirely into penthouses and armored cars, and June has never once asked me to give it up. The scar on my palm is still there, and I've stopped telling people it came from a kitchen accident. It came from a bookshelf, I tell them now, plain and true, the way I've learned to tell most things now. Somewhere in a drawer in our study, I still have the original marriage pact, the one with the exit clause Minsu showed me so patiently on my very first day in this world. The clause that would have let me walk away clean at any point in that first year if I'd ever needed to. I never used it, and I never will, but I keep the document anyway, folded exactly the way it was the day he handed it to me, because it's the one honest thing that came out of a man whose honesty turned out to be a weapon I never saw coming. Some choices, I've learned, are worth remembering you are always free to make differently, even after you've already made them the way your heart wanted. Minsu sent one letter, months after that night, through channels I never asked June to explain. I read it twice and burned it in the kitchen sink, because whatever apology or justification he'd written into it, I decided I didn't need to carry it around with me. Some people you simply let go of, folder and all. And I stood in a penthouse 30 stories above Manhattan 2 nights ago, watching the city glitter below us, when June wrapped his arms around me, from behind the way he does most nights now, and asked if I was still thinking too loud. "A year ago I was terrified of you," I told him. "Now," he said, "you're just mine." I told him the marriage pact was supposed to be a business arrangement, a solution to a problem for 2 families who'd been at war without me ever knowing it. "It was," he said, his voice rough against my hair. "Then you walked down that aisle and undid every plan any of us had ever made." I asked him if he regretted any of it, the truth, the war, the folder that nearly tore us apart. "Never you," he said, "never once you. If there's a moral in any of this, and I've had a year to sit with it, it's that blood and loyalty are not the same thing, no matter how many people in my life tried to convince me otherwise, and that the family you choose to protect, in the end, is worth more than any name you were born carrying or married into. I was handed to a stranger to settle a debt I didn't create, in a war I didn't know existed, by a man I trusted right up until the moment he tried to use my grief as a weapon. And somehow, out of all of that, I found the one person who never once lied to me about what he wanted, even when the truth of it terrified us both. I think about that woman in the wedding dress sometimes, the one standing at the reception counter with a stranger's hand closing around her arm, and I barely recognize her anymore. Not because I've become someone harder, but because I finally understand what she couldn't have known standing there. That the worst moment of her life was also, without her realizing it, the moment her real life was finally starting. The moment the man who would spend the next year teaching her exactly how safe she was allowed to feel first stepped through a door to make sure of it. If you were the one standing in that VIP lounge, humiliated in front of strangers with no idea what was coming through that door behind you, I want to know, would you have trusted the man who walked in to save you, or would you have run the other way? Tell me in the comments, and if this story kept you here until the very end, subscribe, because Maya and Jun's story is only the first door in a family with a lot more rooms left to open.